I've got another small transparent watercolor of a bird to share with you today. This is a ruby-throated hummingbird that was nesting on a silver maple tree outside my brother's house in Pennsylvania. This bird has nested there for a few years now. I took a ton of photos. She always picks a very private spot, which usually means there are only a few different places where you can set up a camera. Unfortunately, I messed up the recording of the opening wash for the background. That was done with a series of different colors from cadmium-free lemon yellow, sap green, and the same yellow, a darker green made with phthalo green, desaturated with cadmium red and burnt sienna, and that same darker green with added ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple. Those were done in a wet-on-wet wash followed by glazes of color to add some additional leafy shapes. Once the background was done, I removed the liquid frisket and transferred my pencil sketch using a tracing paper transfer. I'll put a link in the video description to a video explaining that process. Once the main foreground lines were in, I washed in a quick mass of shadows using a number 4 round brush and a little of my mid-green plus some ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple. This will help establish my overall lighting and unify colors down the road. With that dropped in, I started blocking in my lightest local colors with a number 2 round brush, starting with the lightest green-yellow leaves. Next, I applied some color to my lichens and nest using phthalo blue as a base color. I put in a suggestion of the green mosses, lichens, and algae that were growing on the branch, and then started glazing in a pass of some shadows and veins on the leaves. I was using a lot of different greens on the foliage. Silver maple leaves have dramatically different colored tops and bottoms. Those that were showing the backside had mostly light passes of watered down yellow and in some cases phthalo blue. The front side leaves had a base coat of yellow for the veins. As I glaze in darker and darker colors, I'll just paint around the yellow veins to leave them lighter. Once the first layer of paint was on most of the leaves, I put in another pass of color to the branch. I used a brown-green mix made with my mid-green mixed with Indian red. After putting a few more leaves with the yellow base, I started in the long process of glazing in the rest of the painting in tons of progressively darker layers of paint. Most of this was done with the number 2 round brush. In general, the first glazes go in more quickly and thinner using more water. As the number of layers starts building up, I work with less water and my textures and color depth starts increasing. To many, this is a fairly tedious process, but it's a great way to build depth and to render a lot of different textures. As the paint subtly overlaps, it can convey a lot of information about the surface you're working on. I think it allows watercolor to have the detail that you normally see with acrylics and oil paints. As a trade-off, you often lose that spontaneity and obvious brushwork in a faster watercolor that's done mostly in washes. Those have a real charm and energy to them. Often I'll try to leave some areas of the artwork with a more suggestive treatment, washes and visible brush strokes, so hopefully it doesn't get too stiff. It can be fun to have a looser background, a middle ground with medium detail, and then a highly rendered section for the foreground. That sort of approach often looks somewhat realistic because the level of painted detail sort of mimics the depth of field you see in photographs. So instead of blurring, you just have a looser painting style. With most of my paintings, I'm not really aiming at photorealistic. There was a time I kind of aimed at that, but it's been a long time. I only use my own photos and field observations when making paintings. I tend to paint from photos that I took that were almost shots, where there was something cool about the photo and lighting, but maybe it wasn't super sharp, or it was suboptimally cropped, or it had distracting elements in the frame. Those are really fun to work with because you can redesign and edit things to make it into whatever you want. Often I'm not really looking at my photo reference all that much once I get started painting. My day job is medical illustration and animation. There you need to be incredibly accurate and clearly render all of your subjects. Being literal isn't always the best solution. Most often you want to fix anomalies in your reference, clean up all the distractions, and specifically focus on what you're being asked to show. It's really just visual teaching. If you can make it look pretty at the same time, well, even better. Painting birds is a lot more fun, but you're still telling a story about a specific subject while setting a mood, and often literally following reference can get in the way. At least it seems to be that way to me. Midway through the painting, I spent a lot of time adding a ton of layers using many different greens to render additional shape, detail, and depth to the leaves. I added another pass of color to my lichens using watered-down phthalo blue. At this point, I thought things were dominated by too many similar values, and that I needed more contrast in order to get the depth that I was after. I started glazing in dark greens, desaturated with cadmium red. I followed that up with another pass of color to the branch using a mix of Indian red and yellow ochre. Now that I was further into the painting, I reevaluated my opening wash. I loved the light yellow green and the out-of-focus feel, but there were a variety of areas where my background was lighter than I wanted it. To get more of a glowing feel, I needed the lighter backlit leaves to have more contrast from the background, and this meant darkening around them. I worked carefully and kept a wet edge to soften the transition to the opening washes, and then blotted that edge, and then hit it with the hairdryer so there were no hard lines. I repeated this in a few places, namely the light leaves behind the branch near the bird's neck, and later around the leaf above the branch and to the right. This is easier on cold press paper than the hot press that I'm using here, which tends to be less forgiving to washes. The majority of the time on this painting was painting leaves. There were about a dozen larger ones that needed a ton of attention, and others sort of moving back in the frame which needed suggestions of detail. The next biggest area was the branch and the lichens. The bird would go in really quickly and accounted for only a tiny amount of surface area, so she was neglected for a long time. I put in another pass on the branch to round it out more. This time I used a mix of Indian red and burnt sienna. I finally decided it was time to get at least a bit of color on the bird, starting with a quick wash of color on the wings, beak, and the head. After jotting in a few more details on the leaves, I put in a glaze of shading to the wings and the face. Then it was back to leaf details. There was no shortage of areas asking for more detail. For the long stems, which needed smooth and steady lines, I rotated the page so it fit the natural motion of my hand better. This is one of those places where it's easier to move around a small watercolor than an oil or acrylic canvas, which could only be rotated at 90-degree increments on an easel. I spent a good bit of time working on getting the lichens rendered. This required a lot of back and forth between adding blue and darkening up the spaces between the leaves. Ruby-throated hummingbird nests are beautifully sculpted out of lichen leaves and spider silk, and this makes them flexible, strong, and really hard to find. I'll often see the birds zooming around our house collecting spider silk, but I've never noticed them harvesting any of the lichens. They're mysterious little birds. While I found tons of nests in our yard, including robins, cardinals, cedar waxwings, house finches, bluebirds, wrens, and many others, I've never found a single hummingbird nest. At this point, I decided to push some of the lichens back with purple shadows. This clarified how the branches overlapped better. The hummingbird got a bunch of different colors. There's a lot of tiny detail needed for the wings and the tail, so I took out the 10-aught brush to render those. While working on the hummingbird, I decided that I needed more contrast to the lighter colored leaves so they could read better. I carefully darkened around those and hit it with the hairdryer to avoid any strong lines over my smooth background wash. While I had some of the dark green paint handy, I hit a bunch of areas to push some leaves back and give more depth. Once I was back on the bird, I did a lot of 10-aught brush work since this was the star of our show and the most detail-rich portion of our painting. The greens of the back were the same greens on the leaves, but I also brought in a little chrome orange to the shoulder area. After that, I streaked in some super dark phthalo green with a touch of dioxazine violet to create the metallic look. For metallics, you want saturated color and contrast. With the bird moving along, I started back to all those lichens. There was a lot to work on. You probably noticed that throughout the painting I was mostly reusing my opening wash colors in the well plate to mix with. This watercolor really had a limited palette. The branch had some of the same greens, but it also introduced different colors, bringing in warms and earth tones with chrome orange, burnt sienna, Indian red, and alizarin crimson. My unifying colors were mostly from rendering shadows, which were painted with ultramarine blue, dioxazine purple, and Indian red. The phthalo blue of the lichens were one of the few exceptions, but that ended up being used on the underside of many of the leaves and the white parts of the bird's throat, so it all sort of balanced out. Sometimes limited palettes make for more interesting paintings. I was keeping my fingers crossed that it would work on this one. Late in the painting, I was moving all around trying to just crisp up loose ends and details that were missing. I'm often trying to find the balance between rendering every last detail and leaving some things out and being more suggestive and letting some of the brushwork show. At a certain point, I run out of things that were begging to be fixed. At that point, I tried to find a logical and inconspicuous place to sign the painting and call it finished. Well, thanks for watching this nesting hummingbird transparent watercolor painting take shape. I painted hummingbirds a few times before, but in the past many have been males, so it was really fun to do a female for a change.